2002, the most famous house in the world almost collapsed into the river. It was saved by an army of surgeons in hard hats. It turned out this architectural masterpiece was born with a heart defect. Engineers had predicted the catastrophe back in the 1930s. The owner secretly ordered extra steel to be installed in it. The architect, upon learning of this, called him a traitor. This wasn't a construction project. This was a war. To understand why this house was doomed from day one, we won't look at the blueprints. We'll look into the ledger of its creator. And you'll be surprised to learn that every stone in its walls was paid for, not just with money, but with the desperation of the Great Depression, with cheap lipstick and nylon stockings, the kind your great-grandmothers might have bought. So how did the most ruthless businessman in Pittsburgh, a man who trusted only numbers, build a monument to his ego that turned out to be so fragile it survived only in spite of his will? We think we know this house. We've seen it in books, on posters, in dreams. An icon of the 20th century, a manifesto of organic architecture, a prayer in stone and glass frozen over a forest river in Pennsylvania. It seems eternal, unshakable, as if it grew from the very rock on which it stands. But this is an illusion. This house is slowly killing itself. Drop by drop, it drinks the river that was meant to be its servant, and moisture, penetrating its concrete bones, grinds them down from the inside. Every rustle of leaves, every crash of water against stone, is a countdown to its demise. In 2002, the illusion shattered. An army invaded this forest clearing. Surgeons in hard hats, armed with laser scalpels and coils of steel tendons. They came not to build, but to save. Their mission, to keep the masterpiece from falling into the abyss. For several months, a quiet, desperate war against gravity was waged, encrypted in millimeters of sag and tons of tension. Without this intervention, without this open heart surgery, it would have simply collapsed into the river. The prediction of the engineers, made in the 1930s, came true with frightening accuracy. The house was born with a heart defect. To understand this disease, one must look into the face of its creator, not the architect, the client. Here he is, Edgar Kaufmann, the king of Pittsburgh's Fifth Avenue, a titan of retail whose empire was built on the smoke of steel mills and the glitter of cheap jewelry. He saw the world not as a garden, but as a battlefield. He didn't build, he conquered. His currency wasn't just steel or coal. His currency was will, an indomitable, ruthless will that crushed competitors and dictated fashion to an entire city. And when this man decided to build a country house, he demanded not a sanctuary. He demanded a trophy, a monument to his power over the market, over society, and ultimately over nature itself. So how did the most pragmatic and ruthless businessman in Pittsburgh, a man who trusted only the numbers in his ledger, build not just a house, but a living paradox, a monument to his ego that turned out to be so fragile it survived only in spite of his will? Before becoming a prayer in stone, this house was a line item in a ledger. Before merging with nature, it was born in the very heart of an industrial hell. Smoke, steel, money. This was the genetic code of Pittsburgh in the early 20th century. The forge of the nation, where the air was thick with soot and the rivers ran black with coal dust. And in the center of this roaring cauldron stood a temple to a new god, commerce, Kaufmann's department store. His empire was founded not on aristocratic connections, but on the cold, hard logic of capital. His uncles, immigrants from Germany, started with a small shop in 1871. But Edgar Kaufmann turned the family business into a weapon. His department store, the Grand Depot, didn't just sell goods. It waged war. Price wars were his favorite tactic. He would slash prices, selling goods at a loss to lure in customers and drive competitors to bankruptcy. Once the enemy was destroyed, the prices returned. This wasn't trade. It was a war of attrition, paid for from the pockets of his rivals. This wealth was built on exhaustion, on the feet of thousands of saleswomen who stood behind counters for 10 to 12 hours a day. Their low wages were the fuel for this luxury machine. Kaufmann was, admittedly, progressive for his time. He introduced the 40-hour work week before it became law. But this wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was a calculation, a preemptive strike to avoid strikes and preserve his reputation. The most bitter irony lies in the timing. While America was suffocating in the grip of the Great Depression, while millions stood in soup lines, Kaufmann's department store thrived. He understood the psychology of desperation. He sold not necessity, but a dream, affordable luxury, cheap lipstick that allowed a woman to forget about hunger for an hour, nylon stockings that offered the illusion of belonging to another world. Every cent set aside for this small joy became a microscopic brick in the foundation of a future architectural masterpiece. The money for Fallingwater was not taken from old family savings. It was taken directly from the cash register, from the daily earnings of this theater of survival. Every stone in the walls of Fallingwater is paid for with this harsh reality. Its elegant lines conceal the memory of ruthless competition. Its soaring balconies are supported not only by steel, but by unpaid overtime. That was the price Pittsburgh paid for the ambitions of its king. There was money, there was power, but it wasn't enough. The merchant wanted immortality, and he was willing to pay any price for it. Kaufmann's name was engraved on every sign in downtown Pittsburgh. It was printed in every newspaper, but it wasn't in the history books. Wealth was fleeting, power temporary. Edgar Kaufmann, suffering from the eternal complex of the nouveau riche, a man who merely sells things, yearned for more. He wanted to turn the profits from nylon stockings and lipstick into eternity. He didn't just need a house, he needed a monument. And then his son, Edgar Jr., a young man in love with avant-garde art, spoke a name that was both a legend and a curse: Lloyd Wright. At that time, Wright was 67 years old. To the architectural world, he was a ghost, a great genius whose career seemed to be buried under the wreckage of personal scandals and the Great Depression. Turning to him wasn't just a bold move, it was madness, an act of desperate faith that a dying volcano could erupt one last time. Kaufmann brought Wright to his plot of land. It was not a pastoral meadow. It was a wild, untamed land. Defiant cliffs, a dense forest, and a small but stubborn waterfall forcing its way through boulders. Any other client, any sane millionaire, looking at this landscape, would have asked for a house with a view of the waterfall. To build it on a hill, from where one could admire the play of the water while sitting in a comfortable chair. It would have been logical, safe, boring. But Wright didn't offer logic. He offered heresy. He turned to Kaufmann and laid out an idea so audacious it bordered on blasphemy. Not to build the house near the waterfall, but to build it directly over it, to make the river flow through the house, so that its terraces, like stone slabs, would hang over the churning water. And Kaufmann, the titan accustomed to dominating, saw in this not an architectural solution, but a metaphor for his own life. For a man who crushed competitors and subjugated the market, nature was not a sanctuary, but just another asset to be developed. He didn't want to admire the waterfall. He wanted to own it, to saddle it, to stake his claim on it. This was not a request made to nature. It was an ultimatum, carved in stone. This house was not meant to whisper of solitude. It was meant to scream of triumph, of the triumph of one man's will over everything, over public opinion, over the laws of the market, over the land itself. He challenged the elements. He hired a genius to be his weapon. But he did not yet know that geniuses have their own rules of war. Architecture is born from silence, from long contemplation, from observing light and shadow, from a slow dialogue between a person and a place. But this house was born from a scream, from the deafening ring of a telephone that shattered the silence in Lloyd Wright's creative commune. 9 months had passed. 9 months since that meeting at the waterfall, the time it takes for a new life to be born. But in Wright's studio, nothing had been born but silence. For Edgar Kaufmann, a man for whom time was the most valuable commodity, this was not just a delay, it was an insult. In his world, deals were closed in hours, decisions made in minutes. 9 months of silence was tantamount to a declaration of war. And so he struck. The phone call was not a request, but an ultimatum. Kaufmann's voice, accustomed to giving orders, was cold and clear. "Frank, I'm in Pittsburgh. I'll be there in a few hours to see the drawings." Panic. In Wright's studio, his famous Taliesin, terror reigned. There were no drawings. Not a single sketch, not one line on tracing paper. The house existed in only one place, in the mind of the 67-year-old architect. Wright didn't draw until he was ready. He conceived a building in its entirety, down to the last nail, and only then transferred it to paper. But Kaufmann wasn't giving him time for this delivery. He demanded to see the baby immediately. What followed is not a story of architecture. It is the legend of a duel. While Kaufmann's car devoured the miles of Pennsylvania roads, a battle against time unfolded in Taliesin. Armed with sharply pointed pencils, fresh tracing paper, and black coffee, Wright sat down at the table. This wasn't work. It was a trance. The genius's hand began its dance. He wasn't drafting. He was extracting a fully formed building from his memory. From under the graphite, cantilevered terraces emerged, hovering over the void. Stone walls, growing out of the rock. Glass corners, erasing the boundary between the house and the forest. His apprentices, holding their breath, watched this miracle, handing him instruments like assistants in an operating room. 2 hours. Just 2 hours. In that time, he drew everything. Floor plans, sections, elevations. He finished just as the crunch of Kaufmann's car tires was heard on the gravel driveway. Wright calmly stood up, dusted the graphite from his hands, and went to meet his client, like a general who had just won a battle the enemy didn't even know was being fought. This wasn't a creative act. It was an act of dominance. A counterstrike from a genius who proved he could give birth to a masterpiece from a pure bluff, at gunpoint. Kaufmann got his drawings. He was impressed. He was conquered. But he did not yet know that he wasn't just holding a plan for a house. He was holding a death sentence, issued to the laws of physics. Edgar Kaufmann was a dreamer, but his dreams always passed an audit. He admired Wright's genius, but he only trusted numbers. And the drawings, born in a feverish fit of inspiration, were sent for cold, impartial judgment to a Pittsburgh engineering firm. He wanted confirmation. Instead, he got a verdict. The engineer's response wasn't written in the language of architecture, but in the language of catastrophe. Every word in their report was a hammer blow to Kaufmann's ambitions. They didn't see the hovering cantilevers as poetry, but as a mathematical error. Their calculations were merciless. Reinforced concrete, from which Wright wanted to create a miracle, has its limits. its fatigue, its weight. To them, these elegant terraces, devoid of visible support, were suicides, frozen a step above the abyss. They presented Kaufmann with more than just numbers. They showed him the future. Here is an animation based on their conclusions. The concrete, barely poured, begins to sag under its own weight. First, microscopic cracks appear, invisible to the eye. Then, under the pressure of time, moisture, and gravity, these cracks turn into ugly scars. And finally, in one terrible moment, collapse. The cantilevers, breaking off from the main structure with a deafening crash, crumble into the river, taking with them dreams, money, and possibly human lives. The engineer's verdict was unequivocal. This is not architecture. This is recklessness. They proposed doubling the thickness of the slabs, adding massive supports. In other words, to kill the very idea, to turn the hovering house into an ugly concrete bridge. The conflict instantly moved from the aesthetic plane, beautiful or not beautiful, to the existential, life or death. This was no longer just a battle of two egos, Kaufmann's and Wright's. It was a battle of human audacity against the immutable laws of physics. Kaufmann was trapped. On one side, a genius offering immortality. On the other, engineers predicting doom. And he, a pragmatic businessman, for the first time in his life, faced a risk that couldn't be insured. A choice was made, but it was not made in favor of Wright, nor in favor of the engineers. It was made in favor of deception. Fear is a poor advisor. But for a man accustomed to controlling everything, fear becomes a reason for betrayal. Edgar Kaufmann, caught between Wright's genius and the grim prophecies of the engineers, chose the path of a secret war. He couldn't give up on the dream, but he couldn't fully trust it either. So he decided to deceive them both. His order was given in secret, almost in a whisper. But to the builders, it sounded like law. Double it. Double the amount of steel reinforcement in the concrete structures. Embed a secret skeleton of steel in the heart of the hovering cantilevers, one not foreseen in the architect's calculations. It was an insurance policy, a pragmatic businessman's attempt to bribe the laws of physics by adding extra metal to the equation. He thought Wright would never know. He thought the concrete would hide his distrust forever. But a genius has 1,000 eyes. Word of Kaufmann's freelance initiative reached Wright, and the volcano that had been dormant awoke. The architect's fury was as elemental as his inspiration. He didn't call. He didn't write an angry letter. He rushed to the construction site to confront the traitor face to face. What happened next, among the scaffolding on the bank of Bear Run, was not just an argument. It was a battle for the soul of the project. Picture the scene. On one side, the 67-year-old Wright, whose frail body seemed to vibrate with righteous anger. His voice thundered, drowning out the roar of the waterfall. On the other, Edgar Kaufmann, the powerful king of Fifth Avenue, facing, for the first time in his life, a rebellion he couldn't quell with money. "I am your architect," Wright screamed. Those words contained everything, the insulted pride of an artist whose work they tried to improve without his knowledge, the fury of an engineer whose precise calculations had been crudely violated. "If you don't trust me, I'm leaving." It was an ultimatum, blackmail. But it was the only language Kaufmann understood. Everything was at stake. Not just a house, a reputation, the dream of immortality. Abandoned by Wright, the project would become a monument to his own fear and distrust. And then, the incredible happened. Edgar Kaufmann, the man who never backed down, who built an empire on his unbending will, yielded. He gave the order. The extra reinforcement was left in place, but the right to make decisions returned to the architect. It was Wright's victory, but it was a victory with a bitter aftertaste, because under the flawless skin of the concrete, at its very core, a scar would forever remain. The scar of a secret war, which laid in the house's foundation not only steel, but also eternal doubt. Masterpieces, we imagine, are created in the silence of elite workshops by the hands of chosen masters. But this masterpiece was born to the roar of a waterfall, from mud and desperation. Who built this house? Who mixed the concrete? Who hauled the stones? Who tied the rebar in this wilderness? It was an army, assembled not on the principle of skill, but on the principle of need. Look at these archival photographs. At the stern, weathered faces. These are not architects or artists. These are local farmers whose land had been depleted by the Great Depression. These are unemployed miners, spit out onto the surface by the coal mines and left without a means of survival. For them, the construction project in the Bear Run Woods was not a creative act. It was the only chance to feed their families. They worked in conditions that would be called barbaric today. No hard hats, no safety harnesses. The scaffolding was a flimsy wooden structure, hastily assembled. Every day was a risk. Every step over the churning river could be their last. And one day, that risk turned into tragedy. One of the workers fell. His name was not preserved in the annals of architecture. His death became just a sad footnote in the construction budget. But his sacrifice is part of this house's foundation. Invisible, but integral. This house is built not only of concrete, stone, and steel. It is built from the sweat of men, mixed with the icy water of the river. It is built from the calluses on their hands, from the strain in their backs, from their silent, daily courage, while two titans, Kaufmann and Wright, waged their epic battles over the color of paint and the amount of reinforcement. This nameless army of the desperate simply did their job. They weren't thinking about eternity. They were thinking about how to survive until the next paycheck. And in this simple, harsh fact lies a bitter truth. The elegant terraces hovering over the waterfall are a monument not only to the genius of an architect, but also to the quiet feet of those whose names history chose to forget. Their blood and their hope are forever absorbed into this stone. The war for the house was fought on all fronts: the laws of physics, the budget, trust. But the most furious, the most principled battle of all was ignited by a trifle, by a can of paint. For Frank Lloyd Wright, the steel window frames and doors were not just functional elements. They were the veins through which the life of the house flowed, its man-made essence, contrasting with the wild stone and flowing water. And these veins had to have their own special color. He chose a shade he himself called Cherokee Red, a deep, rich, almost earthy color. For Wright, this was not a whim. It was a signature, an artist's flourish on a finished canvas, declaring, "I created this." But for Edgar Kaufmann, a man whose taste was shaped by the understated luxury of European salons, this color was a scream. It seemed vulgar to him, barbaric, too loud for an elegant sanctuary in the woods. He saw in it not the signature of a genius, but a challenge to his status, to his right to be the master. This seemingly minor dispute over color instantly escalated into an existential struggle. Whose house is it? The client's, who pays for every nail, for every drop of paint, or the architect's, who breathes a soul into a pile of materials? Kaufmann, accustomed to his money giving him the final say, insisted on a more neutral, more decent shade. But once again, he had underestimated his opponent. For Wright, compromising on details was tantamount to betraying the entire idea. He believed in the concept of total design, where the architect controls everything, from the foundation to the color of the ashtrays, and Wright won. Not by persuasion, but with an ultimatum. His will proved stronger than Kaufmann's money. The steel frames were painted Cherokee red. Every time we look at this house, that red color leaps out. It burns against the backdrop of gray stone and green forest. But it's not just a color, it's a scar. It is the visible trace of the most important battle that was fought on this construction site. A battle not for structural integrity or budget, but for the right to be called the author. This red color is an eternal reminder that Edgar Kaufmann, who paid for every stone in these walls, never became their absolute master. He bought the house, but the soul of that house would forever belong to another. They thought they had conquered nature, that they had saddled the elements, turning them into a backdrop for their lives. But the nature they tried to frame within architecture struck back, and its weapon was not a storm or a flood. Its weapon was a whisper. The sound of the waterfall, which from a distance seemed a romantic murmur, became a form of torture inside the house. It was not a soothing sound. It was a deafening, incessant, maddening roar. It penetrated through stone and glass, filling every room, every moment of silence. Wright called it the music of the house, but for its inhabitants, it was a cacophony from which there was no escape. Along with the sound came the water, not just the river flowing beneath the house, but the moisture hanging in the very air. It seeped in everywhere. It settled on the cold stone walls, giving birth to ugly patches of mold. It soaked the expensive clothes in the closets, leaving behind a musty smell. The precious works of art Kaufmann had bought to adorn his triumph were slowly dying in this damp atmosphere. And finally, the house began to leak. Immediately. From the very first days after construction was completed. Water found its way through the roof, through the joints of the window frames. These weren't just drips. They were the tears of the house, mourning its own imperfection. The culmination of this struggle was a telephone conversation that became a legend. Edgar Kaufmann, furious over another leak, called Wright. "Frank," he growled into the phone, "it's dripping right onto my desk." He expected an apology, sympathy, a promise to fix everything. Wright's response was like the crack of a whip. Cold, full of icy contempt, he uttered a phrase that became the epitaph of their relationship. "Edgar, move your desk." In those 3 words was the entire essence of their conflict. For Kaufmann, the house was a functional object that was supposed to serve him. For Wright, it was a work of art that one was supposed to serve. The leak wasn't a builder's mistake. It was the price that had to be paid for living inside a masterpiece. The nature they had tried to subdue had returned to become a permanent, inconvenient, wet houseguest, and the curse of the waterfall took up residence within those walls forever. For Edgar Kaufmann, the world consisted of numbers: debit, credit, profit, loss. He had built his empire on his ability to count money, but in the forests of Pennsylvania, he encountered a force that could not be confined within the bounds of a budget. That force's name was Frank Lloyd Wright. Their war was waged not only on the construction site, but also in the pages of accounting ledgers. Every bill from the architect was a new battle. Every line of expenses, a new cause for a scandal. It had all started so beautifully. The initial budget they had agreed upon was $35,000, a substantial but perfectly reasonable sum for a millionaire's country home. Kaufmann, accustomed to financial discipline, considered this figure to be set in stone. Wright, however, saw it merely as a starting point. seed money for his work of art, and the budget turned into a financial black hole. $35,000 became $75,000 for the house alone. Then another $22,000 for the furniture, which Wright designed himself and which could not be refused. $50,000 for the guest house. $8,000 for the architect's own fee. The final cost skyrocketed to $155,000. It exceeded the original budget by more than 4 times. For Kaufmann, this was not just an overage, it was a financial humiliation. He, the king of retail, the master of price wars, was helpless before the creative appetite of one man. Their correspondence from that period is a chronicle of mutual accusations. Kaufmann, with the fury of a merchant who has been cheated, accused Wright of thoughtless extravagance and contempt for money. Wright, with the arrogance of an artist, responded by accusing Kaufmann of bourgeois stinginess and an inability to understand the true value of art. This war of numbers ran deeper than a simple dispute about money. It exposed the chasm between two worlds, the world of capital, where everything has its price, and the world of art, where price is meaningless. Kaufmann thought he was buying a house. Wright was building eternity, and eternity, as it turned out, doesn't fit into any budget. Every dollar spent over the estimate was another brick in the wall of alienation between them. The house was being built, but their relationship was crumbling, and that budgetary chasm remained between them forever. The day of judgment arrived, the day when theory had to become reality, the day everyone had awaited with a mixture of hope and primal fear. The workers began to remove the wooden formwork from the main cantilever, that very concrete wing that hovered over the waterfall. Silence fell. The roar of the river seemed to die down. The creak of wood being separated from set concrete sounded like a groan. Everyone on the site, the workers, the foreman, Kaufmann himself, held their breath. Their gazes were fixed on a single point, on the long, elegant line of the terrace, for the first time left alone, face to face with gravity. And then, what everyone had feared came to pass. What the engineers had whispered about in their dusty Pittsburgh offices. The cantilever sagged. It wasn't a catastrophic collapse, not the crack of breaking concrete. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible, but all the more sinister movement. The concrete slab, freed from its supporting scaffolding, sank. Just 4.5 centimeters. But that number contained all the terror, all the doubts, and all the conflicts laid into the foundation of this house. The panic was silent, but universal. In that slow, lazy sagging, everyone saw their own demon. Kaufmann saw confirmation of the engineer's words and the ghost of his money thrown to the wind. The workers saw the mortal danger hanging over their heads. The foreman, the ruin of his reputation. It seemed as if nature itself, tired of human audacity, had decided not to bring the house down in a single blow, but to slowly, humiliatingly bend it in a bow before its laws. This sag was not just an engineering problem. It was the physical embodiment of all fears, a visible scar left by the secret war that Kaufmann had waged against Wright. Had the engineers been right? Was Kaufmann's betrayal, secretly adding more rebar, the only thing that saved the house from immediate collapse? Or, on the contrary, was the extra weight of that steel the very cause of the sag? There were no answers. There was only this ugly curve, a silent testament to the fact that a house born of conflict would bear its mark forever. It didn't collapse, but it was forever wounded. And that wound became its first wrinkle, the first sign of the long and agonizing struggle for survival to come. The house was not yet a home. It was a wounded construction site, bleeding lime mortar and cluttered with construction debris. The walls were bare, the floors dusty. But for Edgar Kaufmann, it was already a stage to showcase his triumph. Without waiting for the work to be finished, he threw a picnic. Right there on one of the concrete terraces, the very one that had treacherously sagged under its own weight, he set up tables and invited his friends. Champagne flowed like a river, mingling with the smell of wet concrete. The guests' laughter echoed off the unfinished walls. It was an act of pure, unadulterated arrogance, a feast on the ruins of the future. Kaufmann wasn't just building a house, he was already selling its legend without even having a finished product on his hands. At the same time, 100 kilometers away, in smoky Pittsburgh, another war was being waged. A war of rumors. Rival architects, envious of the project's scale and Wright's audacity, were spreading poisonous gossip. They said the house was on the verge of collapse, that Kaufmann, this upstart merchant, had thrown his money into the river. They called the project Rising Damp and placed bets on how long it would stand before the first flood. It was an attempt to destroy the reputations of both, the client and the architect, before the first fire was even lit in the hearth. Thus concluded the first act of this drama. On the outside, the glamour of a high society picnic, a display of unshakable confidence. On the inside, in the concrete veins of the building, the hidden tension of the sagging cantilevers, and in the air, the poisonous whispers of envious rivals waiting for disaster. The scaffolding was dismantled, the battle to erect the house was over. But all the players in this story did not yet know that the most important, most brutal battle was just beginning. The battle for the right to be called a home. A battle against nature, against time, and against the ghosts that were already settling into its cold stone walls. It became what it was always meant to be, a magnet. The stage for showcasing status had begun its work. Pilgrims of the New World, the elite of thought, art, and power, flocked to the Pennsylvanian wilderness. Albert Einstein, Frida Kahlo, Marlene Dietrich. Their names, spoken within these walls, were meant to sanctify the stone, to turn architecture into a pedigree. Parties, glamour, champagne reflecting in the panoramic windows. The facade was flawless. But behind the glossy magazine cover lay a harsh, uncomfortable prose. Living in a masterpiece turned out to be torture. A house designed to be admired was not designed to be lived in. The low, oppressive ceilings in the hallways, designed by Wright to enhance the effect of spaciousness in the living rooms, forced one to constantly stoop. The built-in furniture, bolted to the floor, turned any attempt to rearrange it into sacrilege. The house dictated its own rules, turning its owners into custodians of a museum dedicated to itself. And it was cold. Not just cold from the perpetual dampness and stone floors that were impossible to heat. It was cold with loneliness, especially for her, for Liliane Kaufmann, the Titan's wife. For her, this house was not a place of triumph. It became her elegant prison, a gilded cage where the only companion was the eternal, deafening roar of the waterfall. She waited here for a husband who increasingly spent his time not with her, but with his mistresses, far from this architectural marvel. For Edgar Kaufmann, the house was another successful deal. For his guests, an exotic attraction. But for Liliane, it became a symbol of her isolation, a monument to a family that could never truly settle here. She had wanted solitude with nature, and instead received a gilded torture chamber, where the sound of the water drowned out not only conversations, but her own thoughts. The dream of harmony turned into an echo of emptiness. In 1952, the music of the waterfall fell silent. In one of the bedrooms of this house, overlooking the river she had both loved and hated, Lilian Kaufmann died. The official cause of death, entered into the record, was dry and lifeless, an accident, an overdose of sleeping pills. But in the silence that followed the tragedy, another word was whispered: suicide. No one could prove it, but everyone who knew of her loneliness, her husband's infidelities, the gilded cage in which she was trapped, they were all certain. The dream house had become a place of death. Its cold stone absorbed the family's final, most terrible secret. Lilian's death was the beginning of the end. The Titan, who had seemed indestructible, faltered. Edgar Kaufmann outlived his wife by only 3 years. In 1955, his heart, which had endured countless battles in the world of business, stopped. The great conqueror, the man who challenged nature to build a monument to his ego, spent a pitifully short time in that monument. He had invested a fortune in it, his soul, his reputation, but he never truly got to live in it. The dream died with its creator, and the house was orphaned. The roar of the waterfall now sounded like a funeral dirge. The stone halls, which had seen the glamour of parties, were filled with silence and sorrow. The house, once a symbol, became a ghost. Its walls held the memory of triumph and tragedy, but its future hung by a thread. Who would pay for its endless leaks? Who would fight its perpetual dampness? Who would want to live in a mausoleum built on the ruins of one family? Wright's great creation, born from the ambitions of one man, proved to be as mortal as he was. The inheritance that fell upon the shoulders of his son, Edgar Jr., was not a gift, but a burden. He received not just a house, but a fragile, ailing masterpiece, demanding constant, costly care. He, unlike his father, saw it not as a symbol of power, but as a shrine. And he understood what his father never had. To save something great, you must admit your defeat before it. In 1963, he did something unthinkable for a titan of retail. He gave the house away. He relinquished it. He handed over this absolute symbol of personal power, along with 1,500 acres of land, as a gift to the public. It was an act of supreme humility, a recognition that no single person could own such a marvel and such a problem alone. But the irony was that not even this gesture could stop time. The house continued to deteriorate. The prophecy of the engineers from the 30s was coming true before their very eyes. The cantilevers sagged, the concrete crumbled. By the beginning of the new millennium, it was clear. Without radical intervention, the house would collapse. And so, the technologies of the 21st century came to the rescue of the 20th century icon. Surgeons in hard hats threaded steel cables through the concrete beams, creating a new, invisible skeleton that permanently halted the sagging. The house, built as a challenge to nature and the laws of physics, was saved only when people acknowledged their validity and learned to cooperate with them. It endured. But at what cost? It was conceived as a monument to one man's victory over the world. Instead, it became a monument to his most beautiful, most audacious, and most glorious defeat. It wanted to be a fortress of indomitable will, but turned out to be a fragile work of art that survived only through the mercy and science of its descendants. And today, as we look at it, dissolving into the green of the forest, in the eternal roar of the waterfall, we hear not a hymn to human triumph. We hear the story that true immortality is achieved not when we conquer nature, but when we recognize ourselves as its vulnerable yet beautiful part. This house is not just architecture. It is conflict frozen in stone. a scar left on the body of nature by the collision of two indomitable wills, the will of a man who craved eternity and the will of a genius who created it. And today, it stands not as a monument to victory, but as an eternal reminder that the greatest creations are born not from harmony, but from struggle. But what if true greatness is not the flawless monument we leave behind, but the very audacity to challenge the impossible? And is a beauty born of deception and pain worth its price? This story has no single right answer. Share your opinion in the comments. What is this house to you? A triumph or a tragedy? Let's discuss it together. And of course, if this story made you think, please support our channel with a subscription and a like. It helps us tell stories about greatness.